Hi, I'm Mark Thorsby, and this video is on phenomenology. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Edmund Husserl's book, Ideas 1, also known as, in its official capacity, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, first book. We're using the translation by F. Kirsten, so that's what we're going to be taking a look at in this video. I will say that originally, my plan was to do more than just the first chapter, but as I was going through it, became abundantly clear that we probably have to take this a little bit slower than I originally thought. So we're going to see how far we can really get through all this stuff. But hopefully what follows will be a helpful guide for you as you're reading this text and as you're beginning to understand phenomenology. So I hope that you'll keep in mind the previous video and the introduction to phenomenology, and especially consider that this book is the sort of Husserl's mature treatment of phenomenology after the logical investigations, where the logical investigations sought to protect, I guess, if you will, the place of logic as opposed to it being a form of psychology or being open to the claim that it's ultimately grounded in psychology, right? That the edicts of logic are just based in the operations of the mind, and that's all. And Husserl gave a great analysis and ultimately refutation against naturalism, and he was well known for that. In the other volumes of the logical investigations, he sought to set out a lot of what really we're going to be talking about, but he was still attacked. But then he was attacked as ultimately conforming to a form of psychologism. So we're jumping right into Ideas 1 to jump right in to, I think, his really, if you want to understand Husserl's phenomenology, you have to begin here. So this is what we're going to be taking a look at today, and we're going to be covering different chapters of it throughout our series here. So let's move forward. So let's start with the sort of introduction. Pure phenomenology, right? And this is excerpts here. What I've done is Husserl writes very systematically in this, so he has introduction 1, then it goes by section numbers, and he's very explicit. It's almost like a lexicon. It's really there's a high degree of classification in the way in which he writes the book, and I'm just going to follow that classification best I can. I encourage you, though, to definitely seek out other source material and other secondary sources. There's a lot of really, really great philosophers who have books that really that talk about Husserl, and in all honesty, probably explain it better than I do, and probably understand it better than I do. So I encourage you to take a look at their works. One of my favorites is Dan Zahavi, and he has a book on Husserl's phenomenology. I don't think I have it I think it's in my other office, but I really encourage you to check out that book. Also, there's a great introduction to phenomenology by Dermot Moran, and I think, do I have that one? Yeah, I think I moved them all. So my apologies. But take a look at those. Some great work. There's another sort of interesting book that came out recently you might want to check out called the Oxford Handbook of Contemporary Phenomenology. Throughout the video series, I'll try to be introducing you to some other secondary research that might help you out to understand this stuff. But first and foremost, you have to understand for yourself. And remember, if it's not clear to you, then you shouldn't just accept what Husserl is arguing, and you should seek to understand it in its own clarity. So, okay, introduction. Pure phenomenology, right, is the science that's fundamental to philosophy. This is sort of the argument that we see coming out of the last essay we read of his, Philosophy is Rigorous Science. But pure phenomenology has a radical and essential peculiarity in the sense that it's remote from the natural things. There's a little typo there, my apologies. Right, phenomenology is concerned with the phenomena, right? That is, when the phenomenologist is analyzing their experience, and the goal of phenomenology isn't to learn about the way the world is outside of the phenomena. It's to begin with the phenomena and stick with the phenomena, right? So this reveals that there's a sort of difference in attitude, and Husserl distinguishes this as a difference between the sort of natural attitude, and you're going to see him using that language quite a bit, as well as the other phenomenologist, and the phenomenological attitude. So there's a sort of difference in attitude, and it fundamentally consists in the idea that since we're concerned with phenomena, we're not concerned with the actuality of things. So So in the way in which we talked about why we don't want to agree with naturalism, but in this sense, it's still possible to have a natural attitude where you treat the world, right, as having this sort of naturalistic basis. And that's how we generally comport ourselves in our daily operations as we go about our lives doing things. So there's a difference in attitude here, right? So I have this is sort of a long passage, so my apologies, right? It's right from page 3. You'll notice that when I give the citation numbers, this is the original pagination that's in the Husserliana, which is the sort of official corpus of all of Husserl's complete work. Um, but here's what Husserl writes. He says, it will be the preeminent task of the first book here to seek ways by which the excessive difficulties of penetrating into this new world can be overcome, so to speak, piece by piece. We shall start from the natural standpoint, from the world as it confronts us, from consciousness as it offers itself in psychological experience, and we shall lay bare the presuppositions essential to psychological experience. We shall then develop a method of phenomenological reductions, with respect to which we can not only do away with barriers to cognition that belong to the essence of every natural style of research, but which, at the same time, also divert the one-sided direction of the regard proper to every natural style of research until we shall have acquired finally the free vista of transcendently purified phenomena, and therewith the field of phenomenology in our peculiar sense. Now, Husserl says this at the very beginning of his introduction, and it's sort of a window into where he's going, because one of the things you're going to see is that well, there's a couple of things I think you'll see, but one of them is, since he moves so methodically, right, it can become easy to perhaps lose a picture of what Husserl's ultimately up to in this book. And it starts to become very technical, and I will not be surprised whatsoever if, as you're reading this, you find yourself sort of losing track of what Husserl is doing in terms of the classifications he makes and a lot of the terminological distinctions he begins to employ. So, but I like this passage because it sort of gives you a sense of what he's up to. What he wants to do is begin with the sort of natural attitude, our general experience in the world, right, in which we experience phenomena, and then through a series of reductions. And these reductions mean that Husserl is he's going to call them later on, he's going to bracket off sections of his experience, and then analyze descriptively the different types of essential features implicit within the concepts that make it rigorously possible to have the phenomena we do. So I'm not doing very good at explaining it perhaps, but he's going to employ these series of phenomenological reductions, and by the time we get there, it's going to be pretty clear what he's doing. But he's giving you a sense of what he's doing here, and because ultimately what he's after is what he calls these transcendentally purified forms, right? What he wants to understand again are these structures of consciousness, and these are transcendental insofar as they transcend the phenomena because they are that by which the phenomena comes to be, right? So when we say transcendent, you can think of the word to transcend, to go beyond. So we don't mean, Husserl doesn't mean that these are transcendental forms in the sense that they exist like in a heaven or in a different dimension. This isn't the view, right? That's an important thing. So there's a sort of religious connotation to discussions of transcendentiality, which you may be familiar with. But it's to be clear that when he says transcendent, he means that these are a priori operations, structures that enable our experience of the world to be as it is. And so it's sort of exciting. It's funny, once you start explaining it, the more you're like, well, it's actually quite complicated indeed, right? Now, Husserl makes this distinction, right? Whereas psychology, by contrast, is an experimental science, right? So, and it's clear, it's important here that even though Husserl is arguing against psychologism, he's not arguing against psychology, right? Psychology is its own science, and it's an experimental science, right? In which through experimenting and observing things, observing people's behavior, you eventually reduce what look to be psychic laws, right? Laws which govern the psychological processes that people have. But that's an experimental science, right? And this assumes that there are such things as natural laws that are materially laden and embodied in things. And so, right, Husserl wants to do the science that comes before that, right? If you will, the pre-psychological psychology. And so phenomenology is not experimental. He says it's an eidetic doctrine, not of phenomena that are real, but of phenomena that are transcendentally reduced, right? So you can see here, phenomenology begins with the discussion not of, when we think about our phenomena, not of whether or not they're real, right? We're going to see that for the most part, the phenomenologist ignores the reality content of our experiences, and rather it seeks to understand through any phenomena whatsoever what we can reduce as being the case transcendentally, right? So phenomenology is a cognition of essences, not of matters of fact. And we're going to see that chapter 1 here is really about this. It's about essences and matters of fact. And Husserl really doesn't even start doing a phenomenology in chapter 1, and you're going to see that he doesn't. It's actually fairly, it can be brutal reading, in fact. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to lay out really a schema in this chapter for understanding what essences are, right? So, so that way when we start doing a phenomenology, we'll already have a sort of worked out vocabulary to describe our experiences in terms of these transcendental features. And so this is going to require Husserl to essentially, you will see there's a bridge here, a strong bridge, in fact, an indebted bridge to Husserl's earlier work, The Logical Investigations. Okay, so part 1, now part 1 of ideas here is essence and eidetic cognition. We're just going to, in part 1 today, we're just going to go to chapter 1 of part 1, in which the whole chapter is just about the distinction between matters of fact and essence. Okay, so let's sort of jump in here. I mean, you can see I'm just going to be following, these are actually the titles of the sections within the chapter. And so chapter 1 here, I think there's 19 of these, 19 sections. So we're going to go through those here, and they really build upon each other. But I will say that this video is not a replacement for the actual text. So it's really important that you read this, because in the text, Husserl more systematically and exhaustively gives arguments related to all of these, which just because there's a video and the way that these things go, I won't be able to fully cover. So make sure to read it. Okay, so natural cognition and experience, right? Natural cognition begins with experience and it remains within experience, right? So think about when I experience something, right? If I experience something naturally, like the book, or I experience a cat walking by, or something of this sort, right? This cognition is in experience. It begins with my experience and it remains within my experience logically, right? I'm only, when I analyze that, right, I'm only analyzing my experience as such, right? So what we want to investigate is the horizon of the investigation, though, for instance, is the world. And the world is the sum total of objects of possible experience and experiential cognition. So whenever we talk about the world, what we're talking about is all of the possibilities that exist in terms of my natural cognition. That's what the world is, right? You can see here that what we're trying to give is a generalized description of what sort of cognition, what cognition is, and what we mean by certain sorts of things, and what Husserl is going to mean by these terms, right? So the world is this horizon investigation, but in the natural world, it's all of these different objects, right? And natural experience begins originally always as perception, right? So I perceive objects, I just through my senses, right? And then with that perception, that's where my natural experience begins. In terms of, but of course, in the stream of experience, there's sort of perceptions and natural experience sort of go hand in hand. So that's the first sort of thing. Number 2, matters of fact. Now, here it's helpful to consider David Hume, which you'll recall in the Rigorous Science article. Husserl, right, talks, I think, or maybe I'm thinking of Logical Investigations. Husserl talks about Hume, right? And Hume made this distinction that's helpful just to sort of know about, the distinction between matters of fact and relations of ideas. In fact, I think on my Hume video, I discussed this distinction. So a matter of fact for Hume, now this is not Husserl, but for Hume, is basically anything that happens in the world. You see it, you experience it, it's a fact, it happened, right? It's in the world. But for Hume, a matter of fact has no absolute certainty to it, right? So a matter of fact is contingent by necessity, right? Because there's nothing about a matter of fact, the way something happens, which tells us that it had to happen like that. It could happen other ways, right? So relations of ideas, by contrast, are these different things. And without going into Hume's epistemological framework, what we can say is that a relation of idea concerns the ways in which our ideas relate together. And what we discover is that there are certain necessary relationships between the way in which our ideas relate together, not in terms of our experiences, right? So I can imagine there's nothing that says in principle it's impossible to experience, for instance, a dog walking and then the dog just start to fly, right? We never experience that, but there's nothing in principle that says that can't happen, right? Even though I know it can't happen, right? Because of my natural cognition, because of natural science and my natural experience, right? So there's nothing that says that can't happen. But by contrast, 2 plus 2 equals 5 can never happen, right? So you can see there's a certain sort of contingent certainty that maybe we can get with matters of fact for Hume, but there's an absolute certainty that's possible in relations of ideas. And what we're really going to see that here, Husserl is maintaining the rhythm of Hume's insight here. And he's going to really argue that ultimately the natural scientists study matters of fact, but phenomenology doesn't study matters of fact, it studies essences. And it's really, if you will, taking this thing of the relations of idea and exploding it into really this huge sort of thing. So you might say that phenomenology, from Husserl's perspective, at the end of the day, is something like the science of investigation of the relations of ideas, right? In their pure transcendental sense, right? So we got matters of fact, and there's also, but there is an inseparability of matters of fact in essence, right? So let me sort of blow it in here, right? So we have the experiential sciences, which lead towards matters of fact, right? We just mentioned that, right? So psychology is looking at matters of fact. It sees these observations, right, et cetera, with natural cognition. Physics does the same, not theoretical physics, but experimental physics, chemistry, and so on and so forth, right? So I think I find here. Okay, there we go. So we have experiential matters of fact, right? So I have this sort of example here of seeing water boil, right? So imagine you're cooking pasta one night for dinner, and you see the water boiling, right? Now, to say that it's a matter of fact is to posit that it has reality content. So I'm watching the water boil, and I'm saying that it's really there, right? And that's what I mean. I posit reality content. I don't treat it as a phantom in my imagination, right? We posit spatio-temporal being to the pot and the water boiling and all that sort of stuff. Now, seeing the water boil, right, and say I look at the pot, right, I say the pot itself has this spatio-temporal being, right? But that's to talk about a matter of fact. When we talk about essence, right, the essence is irrespective of the reality content. That is, the idea, and I don't want to use the term idea because there's an important reason we're not going to use that term, but as I'm explaining this and as you're being introduced to it, think of it like this, right? The idea of the word pot, right, is distinct from and in some way independent of the actual object there that has the reality content. The idea pot, right, there's certain sort of things that go along with that idea, right? Things like you can heat it up, right? You can cook things in it, right? It's metal or it's solid or whatever, right? There's certain essential features that all pots have that fall under the idea of pot, right? But you can see here, so this is the sort of difference here of what we mean when we talk about matters of fact and essence, right? So in the sense, objects, matters of fact, are contingent factualness. In this sense, objects that are matters of fact are contingent, what he calls factual. They're contingent, and he calls this the factualness of the things, right? So he'll use this term factualness, right? So the relationship of the factualness of a phenomena to the essence is a matter of eidetic necessity, right? And eidetic universality, right? So there is a relationship between the matter of fact and the essence, And ultimately, it goes to the eidetic necessity of something, right? Pots are things that must exist, right? So here's a quote. Any matter of fact, quote, belongs to the sense of anything contingent to have an essence and therefore an eidos. So eidos here, you'll know, is this Greek term probably. I've used it in previous videos. Even Plato uses this term for it, and we get this term roughly idea from this word, right? And so an essence and an eidos, right? Every essence has its eidos, right? So any matter of fact belongs to the sense of anything contingent to have an essence and therefore an eidos, which can be apprehended purely. And this eidos comes under eidetic truths belonging to different levels of universality, right? So these different essences, they have structures within them that relate to certain degrees of universality, right? And he's going to start talking about this idea that at the highest levels we have regions and categories. And in a couple of sort of screenshots here, we're going to see Husserl talk exhaustively, not exhaustively, but in depth about these categories and regions, right? Okay, so that's sort of the first thing to sort of get straight here, is that when we're talking about phenomenology, there's matters of facts as ideas. Phenomenology is over here, and now you can maybe better understand why psychology is on the other side. Psychology is concerned with matters of fact, right? Whereas phenomenology is not. Right? Because phenomenology wants to seek what is necessary in all cases for consciousness, right? So it's funny, I often hear students will say to me that what makes something objective is a fact, right? And frequently I'll reply back and say, well, if something's in order for something to be objective, it has to have a fact. Then in what sense could you say that the Pythagorean theorem is a fact, right? It's not a fact in a material way that has reality content, right? The Pythagorean theorem is, however, objective, right? And so you can see here, this is the difference between matters of fact and essences, right? And what phenomenologists are treating. So section 3 here is eidetic seeing, an intuition of seeing something, intuition of something individual, right? So here we want to talk about the phenomenologist is analyzing their experience according to the essences that are involved and in play while we experience something, right? And so this sort of investigation is what he's going to call eidetic seeing, right? So at first, what is the essence? Well, historically, typically, we've thought of the essence as the what of a particular something. Any particular something he calls an individuum. At the very end of the chapter, he defines it. So for instance, if I say, this object here, this is an individuum. I'm just talking about this sort of thing, right? And in classical philosophy, we would say the essence is the answer to what it is, right? Whatever answer one gives. But you can see Husserl is going to go further and give a more refined conceptualization. He argues that any intuition of something individual can be transmuted into eidetic seeing or ideation, right? So when I see this as, so the idea here is that I am having my regular experience, right, is that there's an object here, right, and that the essence is what it is, right? But when I'm actually experiencing something, I have an intuition of it, right? And by intuition, it means I have a capacity I have certain capacities by which I can cognize it, right? I'm, as it were, ready for it. So we're not talking about intuition where I can sort of guess the future, but intuition here as I would call open capability, right? So in any time I see something individual, at the same time, I can transmute it into a eidetic seeing, or that is, I can also understand that intuition as a way of seeing and cognizing ideas, right? This is what eidetic seeing is. And so, but what does one see? And here you have to keep in mind that this is a metaphor, right? This is an analogy, right? One sees the pure essence. They see the eidos, right? So when I think about things, right? Let's say it's one thing to look at a book, but then to ask myself, what does it mean to have a book, right? Suddenly, well, in that case, that's not necessarily eidetic seeing, but what phenomenology seeks to allow us to do is to give us a more rigorous understanding of how it's possible to actually understand and see and recognize these essences. This is not empirical for Husserl, right? We're not talking about our experience of a particular book, right? What we're talking about are the open capacities that allow us to see these ideas, and we can understand the relationship of those ideas and think here about what the mathematician does as a type of eidetic seeing, right? In fact, I think he would say that that's precisely what a pure mathematician is doing. It's a type of eidetic seeing, right? This isn't phenomenology proper, right? So an eidetic seeing can view the essence from a variety of levels, from the most general to the most concrete, right? That is, and think about the different ways in which we can analyze something, right? We can analyze an idea in terms of its most general thing. That would be like to just ask, what does it mean to exist? Or not even that, but what is being, right? That's really general. To the most concrete would be this particular sort of thing. So to understand a particular idea. So there's different categories of ideas. Or maybe a better example would be a general category of ideas would be ideas, right? And then, for instance, a more concrete type of idea would be, for instance, the idea of animal, right? For instance. So there's a range of ideas, and ultimately we're going to see there's a hierarchy of possible forms. Now, there's a natural limitation of eidetic seeing, and that's that it's always one-sided, and it's never all-sided, right? It's not one-sided, and it's always one-sided in the sense that in eidetic seeing, we can only analyze our intuition of essences one at a time, right? Or from one angle at a time, right? And this is going to be ultimately because of our intentionality, right? The fact that we can only always have a directionality in our consciousness. But we're going to see him get to that much later, right? And it's never all-sided, right? So, and this just holds for physical objects, right? And our experience of those, right? All we have are one-sided adumbrations, right? So when I look at, well, I'll take the book as an example. When I look at the book, I can't see the other side of it. It's only through the adumbrations of it that I actually am able to sort of begin to see it. So this is a natural limitation to normal cognition, whether or not we're talking about natural cognition or whether or not we're talking about eidetic seeing. This is a sort of limitation. But we're going to see it's not just a limitation because it actually opens the horizon in terms of being able to really uncover some really interesting stuff. So eidetic seeing at the end of the day is intuition, right? It's intuition. And there's different parts of intuition, right? He talks about the idea that in intuition things appear. So there's the appearing part of intuition. But there's also, whenever there's in intuition, there's always the free possibility, he says, of turning your regard to corresponding individuals and forming a consciousness of an example, right? So for instance, when I look, and this is what I understand in intuition, well, I'm able to intuit this. What's also important about my intuition is that I'm able to freely to absolve myself from it, right? I don't have to be stuck looking at it, right? There's a sort of free possibility. And so in the same way that we saw that there's a limitation for eidetic seeing, there is also the same advantage, right? Because there's a free possibility, right, in terms of intentionality, right? So in intuition, then, really we can say there's two types of intuition. There's intuition of matters of fact, and there's intuition of eidos, or essence, right? The intuition of essence, the intuition of ideas, right? So I'm not going to look at a book, but imagine I do an example here. I have an intuition of the concept horse, right? When someone, even though for instance, I'll be honest, I think I've ridden one horse in my whole life. I'm sure someone has horses near where I live, but I don't see them, right? But I'm familiar, there's lots of different types of horses, but I have a concept of horse that allows me to have knowledge about what people are talking about when they say horse. How's that possible? Well, you can imagine I might analyze my idea. I have an intuition of the idea of horse, for instance, is that it's four-legged, right? An intuition that it has usually some sort of hair on it, has eyes, a certain sort of snout, right? And so on and so forth, right? So, but there's an intuition of the ideas, right? And so there's two types of intuition, you might say. Okay? Okay, so section 4 here. Section 4 here is eidetic seeing and fantasy, right? Eidetic cognition independent of all cognition of matters of fact. Okay, what's he talking about here? You're going to see that Husserl's going to say is that guess what? Since phenomenology is not concerned with matters of fact, and since it's not empirical, right, and we're not concerned with the reality content of things, then that means that we are also open to thinking about fantasy. And what do I mean by fantasy? I mean the idea of using our imagination, right? And imagining the different possibilities for consciousness, because it doesn't matter whether or not what we're imagining is true or false, right? Because the structures of consciousness will still be present. So he actually says, so what this means is that we can then use our the eidetic possibilities as a way of uncovering things, as a way of gaining eidetic cognition, right? If essence is independent of matters of fact, then eidetic analysis can yield results independent of existence and the reality content of intuition. So he writes on 12, if we produce in free fantasy, spatial formation, melodies, social practices, and the like, and if we fantasize acts of experiencing and of liking and disliking, willing, etc., then on that basis, by ideation, we can see various pure essences originarily and perhaps even adequately, right? So here's this sort of idea here is that in this, think about how philosophers use thought experiments. What are they doing? You've probably wondered that. You've heard lots of thought experiments, and if you haven't, Google it, check them out. There's really interesting thought experiments. What are philosophers doing? They give these imaginary examples, and they pull these conclusions out of their hat about them, right? What are they doing? And this is what he's arguing. He's saying, well, because we have the fantasy and because we have this free variation, we can move about and we can imagine all sorts of different things, right? And we can actually explore essences because of that, because the essence is still available to us, because it's irrespective of the reality content of the intuition, right? So you can see here, this is going to become really important because it's going to really introduce, and I think what's exciting about it, it introduces a more formalized conception and epistemological justification for what philosophers are doing when they give thought experiments, right? When they say, for instance, if you write the trolley thought experiment, if you saw a trolley coming and was about to either hit two of your family members, or if you flip the switch, it'll hit three people, or three other people, or something like this. Are you morally responsible if you flip the switch or not, right? It's a famous thought experiment, or lots of variations of it. What's going on there? Well, this is what's going on. You're exploring the essence of the topics at stake, in that case, moral intuition or something like that. Okay, so this is quite interesting and quite fascinating. You see, it's gonna really lay some groundwork ultimately for a lot of what's going to come later in phenomenology, right? So now let's talk number 5 about judgments and essences, and the judgments having eidetic universal validity. Now, we can make a distinction here between judging about things and judging of things, right? When we judge about things, that regards a particular object of some sort, right? We're talking about a particular sort of thing. When you judge of thing here, we're regarding any and all of the particulars for that concept, right? So might say that when judging of here, he's trying to distinguish the types of judgments we make about essences. We don't judge about them because they aren't particulars, right? Because all of my, like the idea of book has an essence, and all of the particular books that I experience fall under it, right? I'm not judging about books. I'm judging of the essence, right? Because there's no postulation of existence. So for an example, for instance, in geometry, we judge when we have straight lines and we judge their relationship perpendicularly and so forth, right? We're judging all of the relations for all of straight lines in the perpendicular formation, right? We're not just judging that one, right? Right. When you figure out the radius of the circle, right? You're understanding it not just for that one, but for any that conform to those dimensions, right? So right. So what does this mean? Like for another example, he says any color whatever is different from any sound whatever, right? So those essences are totally distinct, right? Color is fundamentally distinct from sound. They both have a sort of genus, and he's going to talk about that here in a minute, where both the idea of color and the idea of sound fall under the category of sensation or something like this, right? But when we're doing eidetic seeing and we're making judgments, we're not making judgments about seeing this or that. We're making judgments about the category of the way in which the essence gets related to others, right? So thus the essence, the genus, color, is other than the essence or the genus sound, okay? So I think maybe next he goes into genus and species. Not quite yet, we'll get there. So, but there is some fundamental concepts regarding universality and necessity. Let me sort of start here, right? And so first off, we can have eidetic judgments. We do eidetic judging. That's what eidetic seeing is. And that leads us to the idea that there is such a thing as eidetic judgments. Eidetic judgments have to be in the form of propositions. So you have eidetic propositions. Every proposition can really be true or false. So that means there's such a thing as eidetic truth. What is that? Well, the eidetic truth is that which pertains to an eidetic truth. He calls these predicatively formed affair complexes. This is where Husserl's language, while probably easier to follow in the German, is oftentimes a source for people to stumble while they read his text, right? What does he mean? Predicatively formed affair complexes, right? So if I make an eidetic proposition, right, that proposition is true insofar as it relates, right, to a certain set of relationships that are attributed to it predicatively, right? And they create sort of a complex, right? So imagine, for instance, let's see if I can sort of give an example. Let's imagine I'm judging what one means by the word book, right? I make a judgment, and then I formulate it as an eidetic proposition, right? The essence of book is X, right? Now, whatever X is, the eidetic truth concerns the affair complex, right? So if I say a book is anything understood as a book, no, that's an annoying one, right? A book is any text, right, that is published for long form reading, right? Or maybe that's a definition, something like that, right? And what you can say is all of those concepts I'm relating together, right? Long form reading, and by the way, I don't care. My definition of book is probably not good, but all of those concepts I put together, right? They create a complex of relations, right? Of essential relations, right? We're talking about the ideas here. And that affair complex is what the eidetic truth is ultimately corresponding to, I guess. I don't know if Husserl would like that term, corresponding, though. Now, what is eidetic truth? It's eidetic necessity, right? It means that this idea necessitates this complex of relations, right? So, the unrestricted universality of natural laws should not be mistaken for the eidetic universality, right? Right. So when I say, for instance, that all triangles have three sides, that's universally true. That's universally true because the idea, right, the eidetic complex, but that universality is not the same as like a natural law of gravity or something, right? Or a law of inertia, these natural laws. So those aren't the same things, right? And you can say this is fundamentally where phenomenology is quite divergent from any form of empirical psychology, right? Oh, here I have a little quote I forgot to read to you. The predicatively formed affair complex posited as actual is then a matter of fact, insofar as it becomes an actuality complex. So you can see here is that we have ideas that we also relate. Like we have ideas of actuality, and that's what we're talking about when you treat something as a matter of fact, right? So, for example, he gives this example here: all bodies are heavy versus all bodies have extension, right? This one, all bodies are heavy. This ultimately is an actuality complex, right? This is a matter of fact. Why? Because bodies and heaviness, right? And this is an example that Kant gives too. Bodies and heaviness, there's nothing that necessitates that they be related together. Whereas when I say all bodies have extension, right, that is to relate something about the idea, right? Because by definition, to be a body, you have to have extension. And if you have extension, you're a body, right? You have a body of some sort. So there's a difference here. So this is an eidetic judgment, you might say, or definitely an eidetic proposition. Okay, so number 7. Science is a matter of fact and eidetic sciences. So what's the relationship between phenomenology and to the natural sciences? Well, in the same way that we can distinguish the object and the essence, we can say that whereas psychologists treats the objects, phenomenologists treat the essences, right? So there are pure eidetic sciences, right? And so he says the pure eidetic sciences is pure logic and pure mathematics, right? existence is not posited in the pure eidetic sciences ever, right? So logicians don't care about what they're talking about, right? When a logician says a all S or P or whatever that's not a good example, but if they say whatever the logician is studying, they've formalized it. They don't care about the reality content, and neither really does the mathematician, right? The mathematician cares about the form, right? So existence isn't posited in these. Now, no experience as experience can assume the function of the grounding of the science, right? So experience is not the basis of any eidetic science here. For example, geometry. Oops, move to the next one, right? Now, the science is a matter of fact, right? The physical sciences, and here the experience plays a grounding functional role. And so, again, he's further clarifying this relationship. Now, there's a relationship of dependence between science as matters of fact and the eidetic science. Now, number one, pure eidetic science precludes empirical research, right? So the pure mathematician doesn't go around, with a camera taking pictures of things to learn about the world, to learn more about mathematics. That's not the pure eidetic scientist, right, in the mathematics example, right? They don't need empirical research. They don't need any sort of experimentation. They just need maybe just formalization, right? Maybe they need a tool set to do analyses to understand the relationships of form that they're describing, for instance, when they do when a pure mathematician is doing her work, right? But matters of fact, by contrast, requires empirical research, right? So only matters of fact can come from matters of fact, right? So there's a sort of clean line. Think of it as the blood-brain barrier in the sciences here, right? Where only matters of fact can create matters of fact, right? And the pure eidetic sciences cannot give us matters of fact, right? So there's an important asymmetry here. Because all of the science, as a matter of fact, depend first and foremost on these eidetic formulations, right? So for instance, you might ask yourself, what's the relationship between physics and logic, right? Physics certainly gets a lot more of the cake and gets the parties and the celebrations, right? And probably deservedly so, right? But physics as a science is dependent first and foremost upon logic. Why? Because physics cannot proceed without maintaining a logical form. And so this is really, really important. So this means that it's asymmetrical, right? So the eidetic science precedes or comes before, is more fundamental, if you will, than the science of matter of fact, or the physical sciences for short. So an empirical science must proceed according to these formal principles treated in logic. Now, when we understand essences, he's going to talk about this idea of regional ontology. And this is the idea that it looks like our concepts have certain sort of regions in which they relate to each other. Like, so one region might be things that are sensible, and another region might be things that are only intelligible. And these sort of refer to ideas. Now, we're only talking about ideas in both cases, but they relate differently to each other, right? And there's a lot of other concepts that fall under them. So this is this idea he says on 19, we assume that the regional essences are the basis for such abundant and highly ramified cognitions that with respect to their systematic explication is indeed worth speaking of a science or of a whole complex of ontological distinctions corresponding to a single generic components of the region, right? So the material sciences correspond to a region of the natural essence region, right? So if we took the term natural, right, and that refers to a whole region of things, and material science falls underneath it, right? So as the sciences become more rationally pure, they develop increasingly more eidetic grounds. So this means that we're not saying necessarily that go back to the blood-brain barrier, we're not saying that scientists can't be concerned about logic. They can be, right? And in fact, what we do see is we see that as sciences develop, they increasingly seem to develop more eidetic grounding. That is, they begin to clarify their own conceptual regions. Now, we're going to see not well enough, right? Now, when we talk about regions have categories, right? So you can see what Husserl is doing is he's really just sort of laying out the sort of the groundwork, or think of he's like an architect in this chapter. He's giving us sort of the blueprint, and he's just telling us what the things mean on the giving us a description of what the diagram is supposed to mean and what the tools are that he's using. And we have region and category. Now, a region and category, these are not the essences of objects, right? But they're objects under essences, right? Now, I gave this sort of example. I like this metaphor of thinking about a whole bunch of pieces of paper sort of flipped out, right? And what we can say here is that these regions have a hierarchical structure, right? And that within these regions, there's objects, right? We're ultimately looking not for the objects, but the essences. Now, in some ways, it gets difficult because you can talk about an essence as an object, and sometimes it seems like we do that, right? But objects point to a primary objectivity, and this is different than a region and a category. So let's sort of zoom in here. Well, this sort of lays bare the really key thing, which is what we call the formal region. The formal region here is, it's one thing to just evaluate the ideas, but what Husserl is doing is he's trying to understand what does it mean to have a formal eidetic form at all, right? And that means that all of the essences have certain formal properties, which means that all of the essences fall, it would seem, under the essence of formal or something like this. Now, what does that do? Let's jump in, right? He says on 21, on the one side stands material essence, and in a certain sense, those are essences proper. But on the other side stands a mere essence form, which is indeed an essence, but something completely empty, an essence that fits all possible essences. So you can see here that on the one hand, we can talk about the eidetic ontology and the regional ontology for a certain category of concepts. Let's say, for instance, it's sensation, and then we'll talk about smelling, tasting, hearing, seeing, etc. Right? That's not formal, though, right? Formal would be to understand the necessary structures in which it would be the case for any content whatsoever. So a formal ontology contains the forms of all the ontologies, right? And this formal logic is really an analytic, and he makes this distinction, recalling really the distinction from Hume, the difference between analytic and synthetic. Analytic is when something is known in virtue of itself, right? So formal logic studies the analytic relationships that are inherent in logic themselves, whereas something synthetic, right, if it's known by combining something else with it, right? So what we might say is that when we do a regional ontology for words like the five senses, and we're thinking about these, right, these are synthetic in formulation, whereas the formal ontology is analytic purely. I hope I'm getting this right, but that's how I'm understanding it, right? So now, how we talk about these things, so there's a sort of syntax to the way we talk about these things. That is, there's sort of structures of what you can say and what you can't say, right? And these are but these are formal properties. So syntax refers to the form in which these sorts of things get plugged in, right? And sometimes there's these syntactical objectivities and what he calls ultimate substrates and syntactical categories. So let's sort of take these quickly. A syntactical objectivity, these are any objects that are derived from objectivities by means of their syntactical forms. In a syntactical category, these are categories that come from these, right? So we have syntactical objectivities, right? And these are basically the objects of the forms, of the way in which we talk about these essences, and they have their own categories, right? So, but the formal region, any objectivity whatsoever, is divided into ultimate substrates and syntactical objectivities. The latter we call syntactical derivatives. So this language will come up later. So what is a syntactical derivative? It's when you're able to derive something from the formal region in terms of the way in which the formal structure has to be. So every object, insofar as it can be explicated, takes on various syntactical forms, right? There's different ways in which we talk about and describe things. And those syntactical forms, right, they're ultimately what determine the relationships of our thinking, right? So here we can often think about the relationship between thinking and language, right? We always think in language, or at least that seems to be the only type of thinking we can talk about, ironically. And so as a result, the syntax, that is the logical category, the logical relations within these essential objects, well, those ultimately are what do the determining. So a formal ontology looks at all of these sorts of things. Now, again, this is getting sort of into the nuts and bolts. I hope you don't get lost in the weeds here, Husserl, because we're going to come up on something really important right now, and that's genus and species from section 12. Now, what is the genus? The genus is the higher essence. I said that they are sort of hierarchically related. Genus is the higher essence, and species is the lower essence, right? So let's take an example, right? Let's take the example sensation and then smelling, right? Smelling is a sensation. So which one is higher? Well, you already know, right? The genus in that sort of relationship would be sensation, and the species, one member with many other members, would be smelling, right? And so the idea here is that when we go ahead and start doing our phenomenology and describing these essences, what we're going to be describing them in terms of this sort of hierarchical structure between genus and species. So each essence has its place with somewhere within that hierarchy, right? The higher you go, the more general it is, and the more, I don't know if down is the right word, but the more particular one goes, you have greater specificity in that, or the further down you go in the hierarchy, I guess the greater specificity. You might think this is the difference between whole and part, right? The whole and the part is a sort of helpful way to think about these things. Now, genus and species. So you can see he's sort of laying this all out, right? We're sort of getting this schematic built for this next couple chapters and eventually part 2. Now, in section 13, Husserl then discusses generalization and formalization, and here he asks, how are we to distinguish these levels of relationships, right? There's two different movements. On the one hand, we can talk about the universal, and that can take and then we can then understand what that would mean in terms of its materialization. But we can also understand things from the materialization and then abstract to the universalization, right? He says the subordinating of essence to the formal universality of a pure logical essence must not be mistaken for the subordinating of essence to its higher essential genera, right? So the example here is the essence of a triangle is subordinate to the essence of a spatial shape, right? The essence of red is subordinate to sensuous quality, right? But both of these are subordinate to the essence of essence, right? Because both red and triangle are both essences. So that means essence is the big category. And ultimately what he's going to say here is we have to be careful, right? That means that there's a different way in which we're relating things together here. Because notice, when we take red and triangle and then go say they're both essences, right? There's a difference there from saying that there's all these different essences, and here's some examples. What exactly is the difference here? I'm sorry, there's a difference between, not that example, there's a difference between saying that red is a type of sensation and that what is it? Triangle is a type of spatial body. That's different than saying that they're both essences. So what's going to, you're going to see he's going to adopt the language of extension, right? So he's going to say that they're both independent essences with different regional ontologies, but how are they related together? Well, they're related by extension to this sort of kind of primary essence, right? So generalization and formalization are different. So to generalize is different than to formalize, right? All of these essences are essences by their form. So that's different than generalizing what, up, as it were. So he says we have to avoid the mistake of thinking that the way any essence falls under another essence is synonymous with a subordination to a higher species of genus, right? As higher species or genus. So just because we isolate one relationship doesn't necessarily mean that everything above that one immediately counts. What it means is that it's not really a hierarchy, it's more multidimensional by extension. So we have extensionality between these concepts. So, and this is what he calls eidetic extension. And you can imagine there's different types of extension. There's empirical extension, right? You could say that when someone says, I know what a poster is, as opposed to, I saw the poster, right? There's a difference there but there's a relationship in terms of empirical extension, for instance. I hope that example helps, right? Okay, so let's look at 14. So here we're talking about there's substrate categories, and this part I'm going to go over fairly quickly. I don't think it's really going to be too important. Well, I don't know. It's important, but Husserl thinks everything's important, so I'm trying to think what's important for our lecture. So I'll go quickly, right? When we talk about substrates, what we're talking about is really these sorts of capacities for these essential genuses, right? And within these empty substrates, remember, we're doing formal ontology here, so this is purely just formal, right? Within these empty substrates, there's syntactical objectivities, right? So there's different ones. There's different ways in which these concepts are related together. And these have a fair complexes in pure logic, right? There's a sort of material, from here, this one possibility, one example here of these would be a material objectivity, right? But when we talk about a material objectivity, we're not talking about this thing here, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about its formal possibility, right? And so he says to keep it straight, we're not talking about this when we talk about materialization in formal ontology. We're talking about the possibility of a material ontology with this syntactic objectivity in a fair complex. So he designates this Aristotelian term toditi in order to designate that. So we're going to skip over that. I don't want you to get too lost in the weeds. Okay, 15. Self-sufficient and non-self-sufficient objects. And this is where he begins to define what he calls the concretum and the individuum. Now let's make a distinction between the types of eidetic objects that we can see, right? The types of ideas that we can investigate. Some are self-sufficient and some are non-self-sufficient. The ones that are self-sufficient don't refer to any other substrate of the form that they have, right? They don't need to refer to a greater substrate. Whereas a non-sufficient form does have to refer back. So that means that the self-sufficiency here is a way of understanding really the relationship of necessity that we would tease out. And so this is the really key thing here from this chapter I want you to catch, which is an abstractum is a non-self-sufficient essence, right? A concretum is an absolutely self-sufficient essence. And an individuum is what we talk about when we say this thing here, right? Or he calls it a this here, right? The actual material, physical essence of something, right? The total individual, right? Think of the name of a person. My name is Mark, so there's an individuum of me, right? But in order for you to understand that, right, you have to have an essence of me is me, which formally we call that the individuum. The ones that are absolutely self-sufficient or concrete, and the other ones are abstract, right? So when we talk about region and category in the materially filled sphere, he then wants to mention, really we're talking about synthetic cognition a priori. Okay, so this synthetic cognition, here you got to think about Immanuel Kant for a minute, right? And I encourage you to check out the other Immanuel Kant video, read up on Kant a little bit about what he calls the synthetic a priori categories. For Kant, and this is sort of just background knowledge, for Kant, a synthetic a priori category is what makes it possible for us to have experience at all. But they're synthetic because, well, it's too much to go into at the moment, so you really got to just take a look at it. But they're synthetic because they're not analytic, right? Kant distinguishes between the structures of our experience which are necessary. The most fundamental are analytic, which means they can't be reduced to anything, and those are space and time, right? You don't experience space, you experience the world in space. You don't experience time, you experience things according to temporal sequence, right? And the same thing goes for the synthetic categories in Kant, which he thought was the ability to recognize that something's not there, for instance, to see negation, to also see cause and effect relationships, to understand necessity and contingency. All of these are categories that we don't experience, but are necessary for experience. That's briefly put what these synthetic cognitions were that Kant was talking about. And really what Husserl's doing is he's drawing a connection to this very important discussion in Kant to his own work, right? So a region, right, is the highest generic unity belonging to a concretum, right? You can see we're developing a more rigorous form of a way of talking about this stuff, right? So that's what a region is. It's the highest generic unity that belongs ultimately to something that is self-sufficient, right? Because we said that's the key marker of a concretum. And now each regional essence determines certain synthetic eidetic truths, right? And remember, eidetic truth just concerns the affair complex that goes along with it, right? So each of these regions has certain truths that sort of fall within them, right? And these truths are grounded, in it as this generic essence, but are not mere particularizations of truths included in formal ontology. So these aren't just mere truths, but these are truths that are specific to that eidetic region. When I say truths, don't get too hung up on the idea of you know, truth outside of yourself. We're talking about eidetic necessity, because that's what truth is here, right? So thus the regional axioms, and we can call these axioms, delimit and they define the set of regional categories. So this will be an important feature for helping us understand how to differentiate different eidetic regions, right? And so here's this example. This is really what we're talking about. This is, I think, what Kant was talking about when he talks about the synthetic categories. He's talking about these sort of the bare a certain region is necessary for all of consciousness. So with that sort of said, Husserl then, I thought it was 19, I was wrong, it's 17. Husserl then sort of says, okay, that's, by the way, the end of chapter 1. And he's sort of saying, okay, well, what sort of conclusions can we draw from this, right? So here's the first sort of thing in my language. So for all of this, for so far, all of what Husserl said here concerns the formally logical sphere, not the materially filled sphere of our experience that we're ultimately interested in investigating and understanding, right? Or we're interested in the transcendental, but we haven't really got to the beginning point where Husserl seemed to indicate we'd start. Also, what we've done and seen is that Husserl articulates a schema for understanding these types of eidetic descriptions, but we haven't actually done any describing as of yet. Now, the eidetic descriptions in themselves, they can explore different regions, and each of them is grounded in rationality and certain synthetic a priori principles or axioms, right? So this is basically a sort of description in Husserl's language of what we're doing when we do phenomenology and what we're describing. Now, the most difficult part, he says, and he's right, is the part of classification of phenomena, because this lies in understanding what the separate regions are. And this is where it can get very, very difficult, right? For example, he says, if we take materiality, that's a different region from that which is when we talk about the psyche, right? Or the mental, right? And so these are different regions, and how we need to clearly differentiate these will become an important task. Okay, so we're going to conclude it now because this is already an hour-long video. In the next video, we'll be jumping in on chapter 2. Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you guys online. I hope you find this video helpful, and keep reading Husserl.